Hegel's philosophy is so important because it weds epistemology with an understanding of the philosophy of history in what has now been called the dialectical method. And oftentimes you'll hear this term dialectic thrown around a lot, but not really be clear as to what it is. Well, in this lecture, I'd like to look at 6 or 7 passages from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit that are going to help solidify what the dialectical method is, the way it interfaces with consciousness and terms like notion and idea and concept. And I think this will help kind of bear out exactly how the dialectical method works. That way we can understand how people like Marx, for example, will take his method. A really good starting off point comes from Robert Fein's Psychiatry and Materialism, published in the Semiotics Schizoculture, the Event journal, which details the Schizoculture conference which took place in 1975 at Columbia University. And Fein writes that what the dialectic sought to achieve in Hegel's terms was, quote, the disappearance of all that is objective, all that is held to be true, all that is definite, all that is affirmative, end quote. The truth, in other words, of the material world lay in its being essentially an appearance, an illusion. Hence, phenomenology is the study of appearances, right? The essence of the objective, by contrast, lay in the thought that constituted it. It is only in thought that the object truly is in and for itself, in that Hegelian language. So the critical consciousness had to liberate itself from the truth of objective being. To do away with the objective was to do away with servitude. Now, although the appearance of objectivity was an illusion, it was still necessary, for it was only through this transparent appearance that the essence thought would allow itself to be seen. The appearance of externality was the medium through which the absolute thought was reflected. In other words, the appearance of the world being alienated from us as an object was the medium through which self-consciousness could be realized via the dialectic. It is at this point that what is called the dialectic of matter emerges. Since empirical things exist in some sense, but their existence disappears as their essence thought is revealed, in other words, they become an object of thought, things both are and are not, and this is Hegel's renunciation of the law of non-contradiction. They exist, but their essence is that which is other than themselves, that is, thought. They become an object of thought, and their essence becomes thought. Hegel thought this the identity of identity and non-identity, the dialectic. The form of thought that could appreciate and eventually realize this dialectic was reason. In other words, through the use of reason, we achieve a philosophy of history which gradually grows in its scope, encompassing more and more what Hegel calls dialectical moments. Dialectical moments are a definite state of affairs which will naturally tend to self-sublate as we go through our philosophy of history. And I'll explain how that process of self-sublation happens because, of course, one of the most difficult topics in understanding the dialectic is sublation, or aufgehoben, or aufgeben. And in our philosophy of history, what we're going to be doing is looking at the way that becoming occurs, or change. As such, Hegel's philosophy of history and the dialectic, therefore, are teleological. They are moving towards a definite end, which is the realization of absolute spirit. And realization is an important word there. It is a process of creating and affirming the real as real, both in and for itself. Because Hegel is building off of Kant, where Kant has the idea of the subject which looks at the world, and the world is the thing in itself, but our access to the world is not in itself. It is a subjective version of the world tainted by our perception. And the idea of phenomenology is to try to grasp certain basic truths about the structures of reality through the way that appearances appear to us, and understanding the immediacy of those phenomenological experiences. And Hegel's trying to find a way to have a philosophy of history which is able to approach something like objectivity through the understanding of the historical particularities of objectivity, through its being a historical moment, which requires continual thought. In the preface, he writes, "The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, viz. To be actual, subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself." Right? So nature is its own becoming. This is reality. And what's happening here is we are approaching a true unfolding of reality in which all moments have been taken account of, in which all truths have been subsumed under one greater truth through the negation of past truths which no longer are true in the same respect, and thus we have to undergo this process of change that pushes us into the future. Now, what the dialectic is going to do is it is going to start from phenomenological experience, which is to say it is going to bracket the world, the innocent thing in itself, and say, okay, we don't have access to that thing in itself, in and of itself. We have access to objects of consciousness, objects of thought, and objects of experience. As such, Hegel writes, "Inasmuch as the new object issues from it, this dialectical movement which consciousness exercises on itself, this development through thinking and pondering, and which affects both its knowledge and its object, is precisely what is called experience, Erfahrung. In this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned which must be brought out more clearly, for through it a new light will be thrown on the exposition which follows. Consciousness knows something. This object is the essence, or the in itself. In other words, we comport ourselves towards the world, which is the in itself. But it is also for consciousness, the in itself. In other words, it is an object for us and towards which we comport ourselves, not something which just innocently sits there. This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself. The second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. In other words, the first is the innocent world as it is in itself, irrespective of our thoughts. The second is that in itself as an object of consciousness, the being for oneself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself, i.e., what consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only its knowledge of that first object. In other words, the temptation is to say that thought itself is not an object, but it is only thought or knowledge of the real object. But, as was shown previously, the first object in being known is altered for consciousness. In other words, as Kant realized, we affect the in itself through our perception of it. There is a bar that is the limits of experience that separates us from the in itself. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. In other words, it becomes something in itself, but something which is in consciousness. It's an object of thought which enters into the mind. And this then is the true, the being for consciousness of this in itself. Or in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made it. So we can see here that approach of illusion that Robert Fine mentioned. The world is essentially something that, for all practical purposes, can be treated outside of the mind as an illusion, because it's not something we can concretely and articulatably talk about. All we have is objects of consciousness, or experience. And this is where the dialectical method starts, is looking at progression within experience, looking at the way that the world, as it is an object of consciousness, alters over time. Like Kant, Hegel understands that there are certain universal structures or categories which allow for perception as such. And perception for Hegel is markedly visual in its effects. He says, what does not disappear in all this is the I as universal, whose seeing is neither a seeing of the tree nor of this house, i.e. not a seeing of something in particular, but is a simple seeing which, though mediated by the negation of this house, etc., is all the same simple and indifferent to whatever happens to it, to the house, the tree, etc. In other words, Hegel is postulating a universal consciousness which resists the changes of the world from moment to moment and carries on itself through basic abilities and ways by which it comports itself towards the world, namely seeing, hearing, touching, emoting, etc. He says the I is merely universal, like now, here, or this in general. I do indeed mean a single I, but I can no more say what I mean in the case of I than I can in the case of now and here. In other words, these are general categories for the way that we talk about things. Now is a present, which as soon as we try to talk about it, that now that we're actually experiencing, it has passed. It is continually being elided and postponed. And this is exactly what Hegel is trying to say. That signification, the knowing of the particular as the particular, is always elided and postponed. We are always thrust into the future and beyond the particulars and can only have access to experience in certain general categories. And our ability to concretely know concrete particular experiences is elided by the fact that we're always passing away from those experiences. We're always engaged in a cyclical recognition of the experience we're in and the moving beyond it and trying to recover it as it is past. As such, Hegel says, I am a pure act of intuiting. And when we try to concretize this notion of now, Hegel says the pointing out of the now is thus itself the movement which expresses what the now is in truth, viz. A result or a plurality of nows all taken together. And the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is a universal. In other words, we learn very basic categories that we cannot do without, and in fact, we don't even need to postulate in the first place. It's there latently, waiting to be apprehended and articulated as a formal concept. But nevertheless, it's a basic constituent of what it means to experience, to be in the now. Whether I like it or not, that's always where I'm in. I'm never in the past as past, but I'm in the past as present, viz. Memory, when I'm recalling the past. Or I'm in the future as now, viz. Anticipation, as I'm thinking about or anticipating the future to come. So I'm always in the now as a general category of experience. And this is our way of approaching objectivity, is we have general categories through which we experience particulars. And when we talk about generals as particulars, that is, we try to talk about now as a concept in our hands, we realize that in fact it is nothing more than a conglomeration of a number of particulars. It is a result or plurality that is constantly being expanded through the act of thought. And this is the gathering up of dialectical moments that is part and parcel of the dialectical method. What we do is we take any moment, this is where the classical thesis, antithesis, synthesis comes up. We have a thesis, some state of affairs, and it is limited, it is definite, and it is particular. But it must go into the future, and with the future comes change. So maybe the same object has passed forward in time, and it was object A at point A in time. Now it's object A at point B in time. It has moved forward in time a certain amount, and thus is definitively different. Also, it's probably going to be eroded or weathered or decayed by a certain amount that is necessitated by that change in time. As a result, we had an initial state of affairs which we took to be objectivity, but in fact it has come out of itself naturally through the nomos that is reason and that is the moving forward through history. We create a contradiction. Two states of affairs regarding the same object, where the same object seems to be one way and another at the same time and in the same respect. Because when we turn it into a question of the dialectic in the mind, when we try to parse out these two different moments, we enter them into the same dialectical moment, which creates what is called sublation, aufgeben or Aufhebung. What happens is both of these moments are superseded in favor of a synthesis, which synthesizes the difference between these contradictions into a new final state that is able to take account of the thesis and antithesis, and thus they have been done away with, but they have also been maintained. They remain as traces in the synthesis, and we can track the dialectical method into the past just as we can history. Thus we have a strange contradictory sense, and this is at the heart of the dialectical method, of both doing away with the past and also maintaining the past in an ever greater domain. Central to the dialectical method is a sort of romantic conception of the self that can look inward and find the truth through that inward movement, through understanding the self. Because what happens when I understand the self? Well, I understand myself, this thing that I constantly am and don't actually really think about, as some object which is beyond me, namely the self, this thing which I can talk about, I can give it properties. But at that moment, I realize that in fact this thing that I have abstracted away from myself is in fact myself. So the self sees itself both not as itself and as itself. As such, Hegel writes that consciousness recognizes that it is the untruth occurring in perception that falls within it. But by this very recognition, it is able at once to supersede this untruth. It distinguishes its apprehension of the truth from the untruth of its perception, corrects this untruth, and since it undertakes to make this correction itself, the truth, qua truth of perception, falls, of course, within consciousness. So this is the movement that happens within consciousness, constantly mulling over new facts, that leads to dialectical syntheses happening over and over again. Now, through this constant cycle, what we have is a force that runs through and motivates these dialectical moments to continue sublating and to continue becoming and changing. Through this, we have what is called a universal difference, which Hegel says, what there is in this absolute flux is only difference as a universal difference, or as a difference into which the many antitheses have been resolved. Right? This is a sort of universal pool of expanding knowledge and expanding reified knowledge. This difference, as a universal difference, is consequently the simple element in the play of force itself, and what is true in it. It is the law of force. And Hegel is later going to articulate that this force is reason. Reason has bred within it a logic, right? Think about the word logos, from which reason is coming in Hegel's kind of Christian understanding of things. We have some sort of underlying rationality which connects disparate moments together and allows some sort of continuity between them, a continuous understanding of history as not a bunch of separate moments, but this absolute flux, as he puts it. Now, Hegel understands that central to his understanding of epistemology and to the dialectic is tautology. That, for example, the self understanding the self is essentially the equivalent of saying, I am I. It's saying the same thing in circles without realizing it until you belatedly can look back and see retrospectively and retroactively the truth of being. He says that in this tautological movement, the understanding, as we have seen, sticks to the inert unity of its object, and the movement falls only within the understanding itself, not within the object. It is an explanation that not only explains nothing, but it is so plain that while it pretends to say something different from what has already been said, really says nothing at all, but only repeats the same thing. In the thing itself, this movement gives rise to nothing new. It comes into consideration only as a movement of the understanding. So this is what a lot of Hegel's critics have said, that in fact, what's going on here is merely mulling over subjects in your mind and pretending like you're gaining some actual difference, when in actuality, it's just the continual repetition of the same. Hegel responds, well, in it, however, we detect the very thing that was missing in the law, viz. The absolute flux itself. For this movement, this is the dialectical movement, the progression of history, when we look at it more closely, is directly the opposite of itself. That is to say, it posits a difference which is not only not a difference for us, but one which the movement itself cancels as a difference. This is the same flux which presented itself as the play of forces. This contained the distinction of soliciting and solicited force, or force expressing itself and force repressed into itself. These are various binaries that he's been building up thus far. But these were distinctions which in reality were no distinctions, and therefore were also immediately cancelled again. What is present here is not merely bare unity in which no difference would be posited, but rather a movement in which a distinction is certainly made, but because it is no distinction, is again cancelled. Therefore, we realize that because we're mulling over these dialectical moments in consciousness, we can retroactively realize that in fact they were not different from ourselves, but in fact were part of ourselves, viz. Objects of thought. In this process, then, of explaining the to and fro of change which before was outside of the inner world and present only in the appearance, has penetrated into the supersensible world itself. Our consciousness, however, has passed over from the inner being as object to the other side, into the understanding, verstehen, and it experiences change there. So we have a change that occurs in the understanding, in consciousness, that is allowing for dialectical progression, according to Hegel. What happens is there is dialectical change through conscious understanding of the non-reality of genuine distinction between moments, leading to a synthesis that merely happens from retroactive understanding of the truth of this synthesis. The important motor here that is allowing the dialectical moment to move forward is not a positive one, but a negative one. And Hegel claims that we can have productive negation, that through negation we can create change. And this is something that, for example, Deleuze disagrees with Hegel very resolutely on in Difference and Repetition, makes really good arguments against Hegel. But nevertheless, Hegel insists that contradiction is the centerpiece that allows for this development. From the idea, then, of inversion, he says, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element. In other words, we need to abandon the idea that we need some external world in order to think. He thinks that we can basically bracket it to the point of insignificance. And this absolute notion of the difference must be represented and understood purely as inner difference, a repulsion of the selfsame as selfsame from itself, and likeness of the unlike as unlike. We have to think pure change, or think antithesis within the antithesis itself, or contradiction. And this is one of the things that Hegel really falters on, is Hegel's understanding of difference here is not an understanding of difference at all. It's an understanding of sameness. Purely as inner difference, a repulsion of the self-same as self-same. We never actually get genuine difference, but we only get difference subsumed as an object of thought, beholden to the presuppositions and the biases and rationalizations that are already within the self. This is a very totalitarian epistemology here. Yet nevertheless, he says, for in the difference, which is an inner difference, thus not a real difference at all, the opposite is not merely one of two. If it were, it would simply be without being an opposite. But it is the opposite of an opposite, or the other is itself immediately present in it. And this is the whole negation of negation thing that's very famously talked about. Certainly, I put the opposite here, and the other of which it is the opposite there. The opposite, then, is on one side, is in and for itself without the other. But just because I have the opposite here in and for itself, it is the opposite of itself, or it has in fact the other immediately present in it. This is self-sublation here, where the thesis has contradiction built into it. It has the propensity for change, and it has a partiality. It is unwhole that leads to the existence of a contradictory moment. And it can yield truth through contradiction with its self-sameness, articulated as a relation of the self to itself. This is what I was talking about earlier. When I try to understand myself, I take this thing that I call the self and I understand it as some other, as something which I comport myself towards. I imagine comporting myself towards myself, like looking at myself in a mirror. And in so doing, I see myself externalized, and then I can negate that negation of my initial selfhood. Because what initially happened is when I understand myself as something other, this other is effectively negating my selfhood. It threatens me with dissolution because it wrenches me in two. So the negation of the negation happens when I negate this difference and realize that in fact we are the same thing. Hegel articulates what I just said by saying, to itself implies relationship to an other. And the relation to self is rather a self-sundering, or in other words, that very self-identicalness is an inner difference. In other words, being self-identical to this thing I call the self shows a fundamental difference within me, namely between my lived experience of me and this thing I call the self, which I can formally discuss in a philosophical, rigorous, scientific, or systematic manner. And there is a difference here, which Hegel claims can be overcome through self-sundering this difference. The dialectical method is thus essentially a question of mind and mind alone. He writes, I distinguish myself from myself, and in so doing I am directly aware that what is distinguished from myself is not different from me. I, the self-same being, repel myself from myself. But what is posited as distinct from me, or as unlike me, is immediately, in being so distinguished, not a distinction from me. It is true that consciousness of an other, of an object in general, is itself necessarily self-consciousness, a reflectedness into self, consciousness of itself in its otherness, right? My otherness to myself. The necessary advance from the previous shapes of consciousness for which their truth was a thing, an other than themselves, expresses just this, that not only is consciousness of a thing possible only for a self-consciousness, but that self-consciousness alone is the truth of those shapes. In other words, the truth was already within one, and it required coming out of oneself to come back into oneself. But it is only for us that this truth exists, not yet for consciousness. But self-consciousness has at first become simply for itself, not yet as a unity with consciousness in general. And this is what's going to motivate the rest of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Thus, to summarize the dialectical process, Hegel says about 40 pages later, thus, on the one hand, consciousness finds itself moving about, searching here and there, its object being the pure in itself and essence. On the other hand, it knows itself to be the simple category, right? This is that general concept of the self he was talking about. And the object is the movement of the different moments. So the object of my thought is the changing absolute flux. Consciousness, however, as essence, is this whole process itself, of passing out of itself as simple category into a singular individual, into an object, and of contemplating the process in the object, nullifying the object as distinct from it, appropriating it as its own, and proclaiming itself as this certainty of being all reality, of being both itself and its object. There you got it. That's the secrets of the world revealed through the dialectical process. This is how we get a full systematic account of philosophy of history, according to Hegel, at least. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful, albeit probably very dense. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to give a one-time donation to the channel, because it helps me out so much, and I appreciate everyone who helps, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.